Did medieval women truly shuffle through life in gray shapeless sacks? Was every stitch of their attire a heavy chain, binding them in silence and servitude from the 10th to the 15th century? Number 1. The myth of drab and shapeless clothing. Many picture medieval women swathed in endless swaths of dull, dark cloth, resembling nothing more than moving shadows. The prevailing image often presents a world devoid of color, personal expression, or any hint of a figure beneath layers of anonymous fabric. This popular idea suggests that women of the medieval period dressed only in drab, functional garments, perhaps as a symbol of their supposed suppression, or simply due to a lack of available color and tailoring skill during those centuries. It paints a picture of uniform dullness where individuality in dress was an unknown concept, and women's bodies were completely obscured by their attire, making any sense of personal style or attractiveness impossible within the cultural norms of the time. This perspective often overlooks the vast changes in fashion across the medieval period and the significant differences in clothing worn by various social classes and regions. It simplifies a complex reality into a single, monochromatic vision, suggesting a universal lack of aesthetic concern or opportunity for self-expression through dress for all women living through the Middle Ages. However, historical records, surviving textiles, and artistic depictions from the medieval era tell a much more vibrant story about women's clothing, revealing a palette rich in color and an evolution of styles that embrace the female form in various ways. The medieval period spanned many centuries, from approximately 500 CE to 1500 CE, and fashion was not static throughout this long stretch of time. Early medieval clothing, often referred to as early Germanic or Anglo-Saxon styles, did feature simpler, more flowing garments, but even these were far from uniformly drab. Women in the 10th century might wear a long tunic, often called a kirtle, layered beneath an outer gown. These garments were frequently dyed using a variety of natural pigments. For example, woad produced beautiful blues, madder root yielded striking reds, and weld offered brilliant yellows. These colors were not always muted depending on the skill of the dyer and the quality of the mordant used to fix the dye. Fabrics could achieve remarkable vibrancy. Accounts describe fabrics dyed in rich greens, purples, and even black, a challenging color to achieve consistently. Wealthier women had access to more expensive dyes, such as Tyrian purple, derived from sea snails, or cochineal red, imported from distant lands, showcasing their status through the intensity and rarity of their garment hues. As the centuries progressed into the High and Late Middle Ages, roughly from the 12th to the 15th century, the silhouettes of women's clothing became increasingly tailored and sophisticated. The 12th century saw the emergence of the bliaut, a garment that, for noble women, was often made of luxurious materials like silk or fine wool and featured lacing at the sides to create a closer fit around the torso, gently highlighting the waist and bust. This was a departure from earlier, looser tunics, indicating a growing interest in shaping the garment to the body. The sleeves of a bliaut could be wide and flowing, sometimes reaching the floor, adding a sense of drama and elegance. By the 13th and 14th centuries, the cotehardie became a popular outer garment for women, and it was decidedly more fitted than its predecessors. This dress often featured tight-fitting sleeves and a snug bodice, sometimes laced down the front, back, or sides to conform closely to the wearer's shape. The skirt flowed out from the hips, creating a graceful, elongated silhouette that was far from shapeless. Noblewomen and wealthy merchants' wives would have their cotehardies tailored to perfection, sometimes even padded slightly to enhance the desired figure. Textiles themselves were diverse and often luxurious. While coarse wool and linen were common for the working classes, noblewomen and the burgeoning merchant class had access to exquisite fabrics imported from across Europe and beyond. Silks from Byzantium, China, and later Italy, damasks with intricate woven patterns, velvets, and brocades adorned with gold and silver threads were highly prized. These expensive materials shimmered and draped beautifully, inherently adding a sense of richness and form to the garments. The texture and sheen of these fabrics contributed significantly to the visual appeal of a woman's attire, preventing any impression of dullness. Fur trimmings, such as ermine, squirrel, or miniver, were also extensively used, especially on the collars, cuffs, and hemlines of outer gowns and surcoats. These furs were not just for warmth, they were symbols of wealth and status, adding a touch of opulent texture and visual interest to the clothing. Beyond color and shape, medieval women's clothing was also adorned with various embellishments. Embroidery was a highly developed art form, and garments, especially those of the wealthy, could be intricately decorated with needlework depicting heraldic motifs, floral patterns, religious scenes, or geometric designs. These embroideries often used silk threads, gold thread, and sometimes even pearls or precious stones, turning a simple gown into a wearable work of art. Belts and girdles, often made of finely worked leather, metal, or rich textiles, were common accessories that served to cinch the waist, further defining the silhouette and adding a decorative element. These belts could be adorned with buckles, pendants, and even small purses or implements, reflecting the wearer's personal taste and wealth. Brooches, pins, and jeweled fasteners were used to secure cloaks and necklines, providing sparkling accents. Headwear for medieval women, particularly in the later centuries, evolved into elaborate and striking forms that were far from simple or drab. While modest veils covering the hair were common for married women and nuns, especially in the earlier periods, the late medieval period saw the emergence of fantastical headwear such as the hennin, a tall, conical hat worn by noble women, often draped with a sheer veil. Other styles included padded rolls, horned headdresses, and elaborate caps that framed the face and showcased luxurious fabrics. These head coverings were not just functional, they were statements of fashion and status, sometimes dictating the entire aesthetic of an ensemble. The intricate hairstyles and coifs worn underneath these elaborate headpieces, sometimes adorned with nets or jewels, further demonstrated a commitment to personal presentation beyond mere practical covering. Artistic representations from the period, such as illuminated manuscripts, stained glass windows, and panel paintings, consistently depict women in a spectrum of vibrant colors and elegant, often body-conscious styles. These visual sources, while sometimes idealized, generally reflect the fashions of the time and provide compelling evidence against the notion of universally drab clothing. A painting from the 15th century might show a noblewoman in a gown of deep crimson velvet, trimmed with ermine fur, with a hennin of gold brocade, its sheer veil cascading behind her. A contemporary manuscript illumination might depict a group of ladies in waiting, each wearing a different brightly colored gown, one in sapphire blue, another in emerald green, and a third in golden yellow, all fitted to their figures and adorned with delicate embroidery. These images are not isolated examples, but are consistent across a wide range of medieval art, reflecting a sophisticated understanding of aesthetics, color, and form in women's attire. The variety of garments, from the loose early medieval tunic to the fitted late medieval gown, demonstrates a fashion sense that continually adapted and offered numerous ways for women to present themselves with elegance, color, and a discernible silhouette. Number 2, the myth of restrictive, corset-like clothing. A common image associated with medieval women's clothing is one of extreme discomfort and physical restriction, often conjuring ideas of rigid corsets that squeeze the body and limited movement. This popular misconception suggests that women were encased in garments designed to reshape their bodies unnaturally, leading to difficulty in breathing, walking, and performing daily tasks. The idea often stems from a conflation of later fashion trends, particularly from the Victorian era, with medieval dress. It implies that medieval women were constantly suffering in their clothing, unable to participate fully in life's activities due to the tight confines of their attire. This narrative paints a picture of a past where women's bodies were perpetually constrained by stiff, unyielding bodices, supposedly reflecting a broader lack of freedom or agency in their lives. It positions medieval women's fashion as uniformly uncomfortable and restrictive regardless of their social standing or the specific activities they might need to undertake. This understanding overlooks the actual construction of medieval garments and the practical needs of the people who wore them. It assumes a universal experience of restriction that does not align with the historical evidence of what medieval women actually wore and how they lived their daily lives. In reality, the concept of a rigid, boned corset, as understood from later centuries, did not exist during the medieval period. The garments that provided shape and support for women's torsos were fundamentally different in construction and purpose. The primary undergarment for most medieval women was a chemise or shift, a loose-fitting, simple linen tunic worn directly against the skin. This garment was designed for comfort and hygiene, easily washed and serving as a barrier between the body and the outer layers of clothing. Over the chemise, women wore their main outer garment, often a kirtle or a gown. In the earlier medieval period, these garments were relatively loose, relying on belts or girdles to define the waist. As fashion evolved, particularly from the 13th century onwards, garments became more fitted, but this fit was achieved through careful tailoring and lacing, not through rigid internal structures. The fit of a medieval kirtle or gown around the torso was typically achieved by lacing the garment. These laces might be positioned at the back, front, or sides of the bodice. Unlike later corsets with their stiff whalebone or metal boning, medieval lacing served to draw the fabric of the garment snug against the body, creating a smooth, fitted silhouette without exerting extreme pressure or reshaping the ribcage. The fabric itself, usually wool or linen, sometimes padded or lined with multiple layers, provided a degree of support. This method of lacing allowed for adjustment, meaning the wearer could loosen or tighten the garment as needed for comfort or to accommodate changes in body size, such as during pregnancy. The purpose was to create a graceful, body-hugging shape, not to constrict or compress the internal organs. Women moved freely in these garments. They spun thread, wove fabric, cooked, cleaned, worked in fields, managed households, engaged in trade, walked long distances, and even rode horses, all while wearing their typical attire. If their clothing had been genuinely restricted like a corset, these activities would have been severely hampered or impossible. For additional support, some medieval women, particularly those of higher status, might have worn what historical sources sometimes refer to as bodies or stays. However, these were not the boned, waist-cinching corsets of the 16th century onwards. Instead, they were more akin to padded or quilted bodices, often made of layers of linen or soft leather, designed to provide breast support and create a smooth line under the outer gown. These garments would have been flexible and comfortable, offering gentle support rather than rigid reshaping. They functioned more like early forms of a modern bra or a structured vest, allowing for full range of motion. The emphasis was on a natural, albeit sometimes emphasized, female form rather than an artificially constricted one. As descriptions from household accounts and inventories often list these garments as simply bodices or stays, and their construction materials do not suggest the presence of rigid elements intended for forceful compression. The evolution of fashion throughout the medieval period further highlights the lack of true corsetry. In the 14th century, the cotehardie, a closely fitted gown, was popular. Its snug fit was achieved through precise cutting and seaming, sometimes with laces along the sides. A contemporary observer might note the graceful lines of the gown and the way it followed the contours of the body, but never mention any difficulty in movement or discomfort. The sideless surcoat, another popular outer garment of the late medieval period, often worn over a fitted kirtle, had large armholes that extended down to the hips, revealing the kirtle beneath. This garment, while structured in its upper part, further emphasized the freedom of movement by its very design, allowing for an unrestricted display of the more fitted underdress and promoting easy arm motion. Even for specific activities like horseback riding, medieval women's clothing was adapted for practicality. While women typically rode side saddle from the 14th century onwards, their gowns were often made with special slits or adjustments to accommodate this posture without excessive restriction. Working-class women, who engaged in strenuous manual labor in the fields, markets, and homes, wore practical adaptations of the standard garments. Their kirtles and tunics, while often plain, would be cut to allow for bending, lifting, and prolonged physical activity. They might tuck up their skirts or wear aprons to keep their clothes clean and out of the way, demonstrating a pragmatic approach to clothing that prioritized functionality over extreme fashion-induced discomfort. The very survival and continuation of their daily lives depended on their ability to move efficiently and comfortably in their attire. The sheer volume of manual labor required in medieval life for women across all social strata necessitates that their clothing allowed for free movement. From grinding grain and baking bread to weaving textiles and caring for children, the daily routine involved physical exertion. If women's clothing had been genuinely restrictive, it would have been highly impractical and would have hindered their ability to perform essential tasks. There are no widespread historical accounts of medieval women complaining about their clothing being painfully restrictive in the way later corset wearers did. Instead, descriptions often focus on the quality of the fabric, the elegance of the cut, or the richness of the embellishments, rather than the difficulty of simply existing within the garment. The notion of medieval women being bound by rigid, corset-like garments is a modern projection that simplifies a complex historical reality and misrepresents the functional and aesthetic considerations that shaped medieval dress. Number 3, the myth of clothing as a sign of complete lack of freedom and agency. It is a common assertion that medieval women had virtually no freedom or agency, and that their clothing was merely another stark symbol of this complete subjugation. This perspective suggests that women's attire was solely dictated by men, reflecting a society where women had no say in their appearance, no personal choice, and no ability to express themselves through dress. It implies that every garment worn was a uniform of oppression, enforced by male authority figures, from fathers and husbands to societal and religious institutions. This view often portrays women as passive recipients of fashion rules, with no means to influence trends, choose their own styles, or use clothing as a tool for personal or social expression. The argument typically points to sumptuary laws as definitive proof of male control, suggesting these laws were solely designed to restrict women's choices and reinforce their subordinate status. This narrative simplifies the complex interplay of power, social norms, and individual expression that existed within medieval society, particularly concerning women and their clothing. It overlooks the nuanced ways in which medieval women navigated their sartorial choices and how clothing could, in fact, be a reflection of their status, economic contribution, and even personal will within the bounds of their era. While it is true that medieval society was largely patriarchal and women often had less formal legal and political power than men, the relationship between women, their clothing, and their agency was far more intricate than this simplistic view suggests. Clothing in the Middle Ages was a powerful visual language, communicating status, wealth, marital state, and even moral standing. For women, especially those of higher social classes, their attire served as a public display of their family's wealth and prestige. In this sense, a woman's magnificent gown, adorned with costly fabrics and jewels, was indeed a reflection of her husband's or father's status, but it also elevated her position within the social hierarchy and gave her a degree of visible importance. A queen, or noblewoman dressed in luxurious silks and furs, commanded respect and attention in public, enhancing her own perceived authority and influence within her sphere. Her appearance was a critical part of her public persona and her role as a representative of her lineage. Furthermore, medieval women played a significant role in the production and care of clothing, an economic activity that often granted them a measure of agency and skill. From spinning and weaving the raw materials to embroidering and tailoring the finished garments, women were deeply involved in the entire textile industry. Many women worked as professional spinners, weavers, dyers, embroiderers, and seamstresses, contributing economically to their households and communities. For example, guilds of women weavers and seamstresses existed in various medieval towns, demonstrating their skilled labor and economic independence. A woman who skillfully embroidered a lavish garment for herself or her family was not merely a passive wearer. She was an active creator, infusing her clothing with her own artistry and effort. Her proficiency in these crafts could be a source of personal pride and a marketable skill, providing a degree of financial autonomy. The dowry of a noblewoman often included a substantial wardrobe and valuable textiles, representing a significant portion of her wealth and serving as her personal property upon marriage, further demonstrating an element of individual economic standing related to clothing. Sumptuary laws, often cited as prime examples of male control over women's dress, also reveal a more complex picture. These laws, which regulated who could wear what types of fabrics, colors, or embellishments based on social rank, income, or profession, were applied to both men and women. Their primary purpose was not solely to restrict women, but to maintain social order and prevent people from dressing above their station, which was perceived as a threat to the established hierarchy. While these laws did limit choice, their very existence indicates that people, including women, desired to wear certain things and attempted to dress beyond their prescribed status. If women had no agency or desire for sartorial expression, there would have been little need for such regulations. The constant reiteration and often ineffective enforcement of sumptuary laws suggest a continuous struggle between prescribed norms and individual inclinations towards fashion and display. Women, despite these laws, found ways to express themselves within the confines of their class, whether through subtle embroidery, the choice of a particular shade of dye, or the adoption of new styles that eventually trickled down or up the social ladder. Even within strict social conventions, women exercised choice and influenced fashion trends. Queens and powerful noblewomen, by virtue of their position, often became trendsetters. When a queen adopted a new style of headwear, a particular cut of gown, or a unique embellishment, other women of the court and aspiring individuals would often follow suit, disseminating these trends across regions. Accounts of courtly life often describe the elaborate dresses worn by ladies, which were carefully chosen and designed to make an impression. These women were not simply handed their clothes. They participated in the selection of fabrics, the design of garments, and the oversight of their creation. Their personal preferences, aesthetic sensibilities, and desire to impress played a role in the evolution of fashion. Moreover, clothing also reflected a woman's agency in her religious life or professional roles. A nun's habit, while prescribed, was a deliberate choice to dedicate herself to a religious life, a powerful act of individual will. The distinct attire of a professional woman, such as a market vendor, a laundress, or a midwife, marked her occupation and identity, providing her with a recognized place in the economic and social fabric. While these garments were practical and often humble, they were integral to her ability to perform her work and earn a living, reflecting her active participation in the economy and her agency in her chosen profession. Mourning attire worn after the death of a loved one was another instance where women adopted specific dress codes not out of coercion, but as an expression of personal grief and social custom, demonstrating a choice to conform to shared human experience. Ultimately, the idea that medieval women's clothing was a uniform of complete disempowerment overlooks the significant roles women played in society, their economic contributions, their active participation in fashion trends, and the nuanced ways in which clothing reflected their status, aspirations, and even personal agency within the social structures of the time. While medieval society presented its own set of challenges and limitations for women, their relationship with their clothing was a dynamic one, where dress served not only as a marker of identity, but also as a canvas for expression and a testament to their skilled labor and personal influence. Number 4, the myth that all medieval women wore the same type of clothing. A widespread misconception about medieval clothing is that all women, regardless of their social standing, wore essentially the same type of basic, undifferentiated garments. This idea suggests a complete lack of class distinction in dress, implying that a peasant woman's attire would be barely distinguishable from that of a noblewoman, apart from perhaps a difference in cleanliness. This view often portrays a uniform visual landscape, where social hierarchy was not reflected in clothing, or where the differences were so subtle as to be negligible. It simplifies the complex social stratification of the medieval period, suggesting that dress was not a key indicator of one's place in society. This narrative often overlooks the specific economic realities, technological advancements, and sumptuary laws that heavily influenced who could wear what and why. It denies the sophisticated system of visual cues that medieval people used to identify each other's status and roles, assuming a level of sartorial homogeneity that did not exist in a society deeply conscious of rank and distinction. The reality of medieval clothing was one of profound differentiation based on social class, wealth, occupation, and regional identity. Clothing served as an immediate and powerful visual indicator of a person's status in a hierarchical society. The differences between the attire of a noblewoman and a peasant woman were vast, encompassing fabric quality, color, style, tailoring, and embellishment. These distinctions were not merely accidental, they were meticulously maintained through economic means, social custom, and often explicit legislation. At the highest echelon, noblewomen and royalty wore garments crafted from the finest and most expensive materials available. Silks, velvets, and brocades, often imported from distant lands like Italy, Byzantium, or the Far East, were exclusive to the wealthy. These fabrics were costly due to the complex processes of their production, the rarity of their raw materials, and the distances they traveled. A noblewoman's gown might be made of shimmering silk damask with intricate woven patterns, while a peasant woman's dress would be made of coarse homespun wool or linen. The quality of wool itself varied immensely. Fine, soft wool was used for elite clothing, while rough, scratchy wool was common for the lower classes. The dye quality also differed significantly. The rich colors like deep crimson, sapphire blue, or imperial purple were achieved with expensive dyes and complex processes, making them accessible only to the wealthy. These vibrant hues were often a direct indicator of economic standing, contrasting sharply with the more muted or earthy tones of natural dyes available to commoners. Tailoring and fit also varied dramatically. Noble women's garments were often custom-made by skilled professional tailors, ensuring a perfect, flattering fit that emphasized the fashionable silhouette of the era, whether it was the flowing lines of the blouse or the fitted elegance of the cotehardie. These garments might involve complex seams, linings, and specific methods of lacing to achieve the desired shape. Peasant women, on the other hand, typically wore simpler, looser garments that were often homemade, ill-fitting by comparison, and prioritized practicality and durability over fashion. Their clothing allowed for ease of movement necessary for physical labor, and its construction was often less complex, minimizing the need for specialized skills or large amounts of fabric. Embellishments were another clear marker of class. Wealthy women's clothing was frequently adorned with elaborate embroidery using silk or gold thread, sometimes incorporating pearls, glass beads, or even precious jewels. Fur trimmings, especially luxurious pelts like ermine, miniver, or squirrel, were reserved for the nobility and displayed prominently on collars, cuffs, and hemlines. Belts, brooches, and other accessories were often made of precious metals, studded with gems, or intricately crafted. In stark contrast, a peasant woman's clothing would feature minimal, if any, decoration, and accessories would be purely functional, such as a simple leather belt. Headwear was a particularly visible differentiator. While a simple linen veil was common for many married women across classes, the elaborate and fantastical headwear of the late medieval period, such as the towering hennin, the horned headdress, or intricate padded rolls, were exclusive to noble women and the very wealthy. These structures often required expensive fabrics, extensive amounts of material, and skilled construction, making them unattainable for the lower classes. Peasant women typically wore simple coifs or hoods, tied scarves, or unadorned veils, practical for covering their hair while working or for religious observance. Sumptuary laws, prevalent across many medieval societies from the 13th century onwards, explicitly codified these class distinctions in dress. These laws dictated what fabrics, colors, furs, and embellishments were permitted for different social ranks. For example, a law might prohibit anyone below the rank of a knight's wife from wearing ermine or silk, or from wearing certain vibrant dyes. These laws, while sometimes difficult to enforce, clearly illustrate that medieval society was acutely aware of clothing as a status symbol and actively sought to regulate its display to maintain social order. The very existence of such laws demonstrates that class distinctions in dress were not only present, but were considered so important that they required legal enforcement. Beyond the stark differences between noble and peasant attire, variations also existed among the merchant class, artisans, and other urban dwellers. A wealthy merchant's wife might wear fine woolens or even some silks, perhaps not as elaborate as a duchess, but certainly distinguishable from a manual laborer. Her garments might be well-tailored, clean, and reflect a sense of urban fashion. Artisans' wives would wear durable but well-made clothing appropriate for their trade, often incorporating specific elements related to their craft. Regional differences in style also contributed to the diversity of medieval women's clothing, with distinct fashions emerging in different parts of Europe, further diversifying the sartorial landscape beyond a monolithic medieval dress. The notion that all medieval women wore the same type of clothing is a gross oversimplification that ignores the vibrant, complex, and highly stratified visual world of medieval fashion. Number 5. The myth that medieval women never wore trousers or practical working clothes. The popular image of medieval women almost exclusively features them in long, flowing gowns or skirts, leading to a widespread belief that they never wore bifurcated garments like trousers and that their clothing was generally impractical for manual labor or active outdoor life. This idea suggests a uniform adherence to dresses, implying that women were either physically unable or socially forbidden from wearing anything that would facilitate easier movement or protect them in demanding work environments. It paints a picture of women constrained by their attire to sedentary roles, or at least roles that did not require vigorous physical activity or specific protective garments. This perspective often overlooks the diverse range of roles and activities medieval women performed, from agricultural labor to trade, and assumes a rigid adherence to a single type of garment for all situations. It disregards the necessity for practical attire in certain contexts and the historical evidence that shows exceptions to the generalized image of women in floor-length gowns. Historical evidence and artistic representations reveal that medieval women, particularly those of the working classes and those engaged in specific occupations, did adopt practical clothing solutions, sometimes including forms of bifurcated garments or adaptations of their skirts that allowed for greater mobility and protection. While full-length trousers as a common daily garment for women, akin to men's hose, were not widespread in the medieval West, specific circumstances and occupations necessitated different approaches to dress. For women engaged in strenuous physical labor, such as peasant women working in the fields, their long kirtles and gowns were often adapted for practicality. A common practice was to tuck up the skirt of their outer gown into their belt or girdle, creating a shorter, more manageable length that prevented tripping and kept the hem out of mud, dirt, or crop debris. This created a visible shorter skirt, often revealing the underskirt or even parts of their legs. While not trousers, this was a deliberate modification for practical work. Illustrations in medieval manuscripts depicting agricultural scenes often show women with their skirts tucked up in this manner, clearly demonstrating a functional approach to their attire. Furthermore, many women wore aprons, which were not merely decorative but highly functional garments. Aprons protected their main clothing from dirt, stains, and wear, and could be made of durable linen or wool. They were essential for tasks like cooking, cleaning, tending to animals, or working in workshops. More direct forms of bifurcated garments, while rare, were not entirely absent for women in specific contexts. Women who rode horses frequently, particularly for hunting or travel, sometimes wore specialized riding attire that might include a form of hose or breeches underneath their outer riding habits or dresses. These were often worn for warmth, protection, and to prevent chafing during long rides, especially when riding astride, though side saddle became more common later in the period. Accounts and illustrations from the late medieval period show women in the retinue of nobles, or participating in hunting parties wearing garments that allowed for more active equestrian pursuits, even if the outer garment remained skirted. In certain very specific labor-intensive tasks, such as mining or some trades, women might have worn protective undergarments that resembled short breeches or padded leggings, similar to those worn by men in similar professions for warmth and protection. These would have been worn under their tunics rather than as outer fashion. The evidence from archaeological finds and historical records, though not always conclusive, sometimes points to instances where women might have worn leggings or hose. While men's hose were a standard item of clothing, women's hose were primarily for warmth and modesty, covering the legs beneath their gowns. These were typically separate garments for each leg, tied or gartered, rather than integrated trousers. However, the very existence of such items indicates that women did wear forms of leg coverings that were not part of their full-length dresses, providing warmth and protection where needed, especially in colder climates or for outdoor work. The social and cultural norms of the medieval period certainly favored skirts and gowns as the standard and appropriate attire for women in public life. However, practicality often trumped strict sartorial conformity, especially for the vast majority of women who were not part of the idle aristocracy. Working women had to be able to move, lift, bend, and endure varied weather conditions. Their clothing, while outwardly conforming to the general form of a gown, was chosen and adapted for durability, ease of care, and freedom of movement. Materials, like sturdy wool and linen rather than delicate silks, were favored for everyday wear by common women due to their resilience and warmth. The idea of medieval women being perpetually clad in restrictive and practical gowns that prevented active participation in life is a romanticized simplification. The diverse roles medieval women played, from managing farms and businesses to acting as healers, craftswomen, and laborers, demanded clothing that enabled their work. While they might not have worn trousers in the modern sense as a fashionable outer garment, their everyday attire was far from limiting, often adapted, or included undergarments that offered protection and mobility, proving that practicality and necessity significantly shaped their wardrobes. Number 6, the myth that medieval clothing was dirty, rarely washed, and women suffered from poor hygiene. A persistent and unappealing myth about the medieval period suggests that people, including women, rarely bathed or washed their clothes, leading to a state of perpetual dirtiness and poor hygiene. This popular notion often conjures images of stiff, grimy garments, smelling strongly, and worn for extended periods without cleaning, implying that medieval women lived in a state of discomfort and uncleanliness due to their unwashed attire. This perspective frequently stems from a general misunderstanding of medieval life and hygiene practices, projecting modern standards of cleanliness onto a historical period with different resources and conventions. It suggests that medieval people were oblivious to cleanliness or simply lacked the means to maintain it, leading to a widespread acceptance of foul clothing and unpleasant body odor. This myth often contributes to a broader, often negative, view of the Middle Ages as a dark and unsanitary era, overlooking the actual practices and resources available to medieval people for personal and garment care. Contrary to this popular belief, medieval people, including women, engaged in various forms of hygiene and clothing care, and the concept of cleanliness was not entirely foreign to them, though it differed from modern practices. While daily full-body bathing might not have been universal in the same way as today, medieval societies did have washing routines and were aware of the benefits of cleanliness. Public bathhouses existed in many medieval towns, though their popularity waxed and waned. Personal washing of hands and faces was a common daily practice, and wealthier households had basins and pitchers for this purpose. Scented waters, herbs, and oils were used to freshen the body and clothes. The widespread use of undergarments was a key aspect of medieval clothing hygiene. Medieval women typically wore a linen chemise or shift directly against their skin underneath their outer layers of wool or silk. Linen, derived from flax, is a breathable and relatively smooth fabric. Crucially, these linen undergarments were regularly washed. They absorbed sweat and body oils, protecting the more expensive and difficult to clean outer garments. These chemises were much easier to launder than heavy wool gowns. Washing these linen shifts would involve soaking them, beating them in water, often using lye or wood ash as a primitive soap, and rinsing them in rivers, streams, or large tubs. Professional laundresses were a common feature of medieval towns and castles, indicating a demand for clean clothes beyond just the self-laundering performed in homes. This frequent washing of undergarments meant that the layer closest to the skin was regularly cleaned, contributing significantly to personal hygiene and preventing the buildup of grime on the body. Outer garments, such as woolen kirtles, gowns, and cloaks, were indeed not washed as frequently as undergarments. This was primarily due to the nature of the fabric and the challenges of laundering large, heavy woolen items without damaging them. Wool tends to shrink and become matted when subjected to aggressive washing and drying without modern controls. However, not washed frequently does not mean ever washed or filthy. Instead, outer garments were maintained through other methods. They were often aired out, brushed, and spot cleaned to remove dirt and odors. Stains would be carefully treated. And fullers who processed wool also engaged in a form of dry cleaning or fulling, where wool was cleaned and thickened using fuller's earth, a type of clay and water, which could also be applied to finished garments. Valued garments, especially those of silk or velvet, were carefully cared for to prolong their life as they represented significant investments. To combat odors and keep clothing fresh between washes, medieval people employed various methods. Sweet-smelling herbs like lavender, rosemary, and mint were often placed in linen chests or sewn into small sachets that could be worn or kept among clothing. Perfumes and rosewater were applied to both skin and garments. Even strong spices could be used to mask or replace unpleasant smells. The concept of sweetening rooms and clothing with pleasant aromas was well understood and practiced. The value of clothing also ensured its care. Medieval clothing, especially for the wealthy, was incredibly expensive, representing a significant portion of a household's assets. A single gown could take weeks or months to create and represent the equivalent of a substantial sum of money. Such valuable items would be meticulously cared for, stored properly, and repaired, rather than simply discarded or allowed to degrade through neglect. This economic reality incentivized careful maintenance and preservation, which included keeping them as clean as possible within the technological limitations of the era. While medieval hygiene practices differed from modern ones, the idea that medieval women, and people in general, lived in a state of constant unwashed filth is an inaccurate oversimplification. They understood the importance of cleanliness for health and comfort, adapted their practices to their resources, and regularly washed their undergarments. The care of outer garments involved different methods, but it was still a conscious effort to maintain their appearance and prolong their lifespan, proving that hygiene was a considered aspect of medieval life, rather than being entirely absent.